Hi, my name's Amanda DeVaul-Fetters, and I'm a PhD candidate in social psychology. And the data I'm going to share with you today I collected with Belinda Dodson in geography and Vicki Esses in psychology. And Chris, I'm going to be answering a lot of your questions that you just asked. But before I start, we wanted to say that we do recognize that there are many different types of military spouses. There's wives and husbands and same-sex partners, but for the purposes of this talk, we're only focusing on American military wives. So just a brief background. Home is a series of feelings, attachments, some of which do become connected to a physical structure. It's a place to which individuals attach significance and identify with, and they're able to experience stability and security, but also being able to perform their habitual routines. And then place identity refers to cognitions we have about the physical world in which we live. And these cognitions can represent memories, attitudes, beliefs, ideas, feelings, and conceptions of experience and behavior that relate to the physical settings where we live our day-to-day lives. And through personally attaching to place, we're able to acquire a sense of belonging. These ideas of home and place identity pose many interesting questions for military families because they are expected to migrate every few years. So I look at military families to begin with. The migration literature tends to assume that settlement and integration are a goal, or it's just something that will happen eventually. But with military migration, it's what I call permanently temporary. They rarely live in the same place for more than 2 to 3 years. Change is the only constant. And they might, for example, move, and then a few weeks later, their partner has to be sent away on a temporary assignment. So they experience moving, isolation, and separation all in the same short time frame. And the ability to be spatially mobile does also arrive for civilian employees as well, but the decision to migrate tends to undergo a really deep consideration at the household level. In this sense, civilian families are more likely to have a choice. They can decide if they want to migrate, where they want to migrate, how long they migrate for, but this is not the case for military families. They have very little decision-making power when it comes to choosing where they're going to live. So just a little brief background before we begin to look at the present study. So it's important to highlight a distinction within the military. So there are officers and enlisted personnel, and the main distinction here is that to be an officer, you are required to have a university degree. You oversee the enlisted soldiers, and there's also a much larger salary that they receive. So for example, I think these numbers came from Fort Drum in New York. So a newly enlisted private, which is the lowest enlisted rank, they make $1,491 a month, whereas the lowest ranking officer would receive $2,800 a month. So there's a big pay disparity. So there's also a socio-spatial distinction within the military between these two groups. So for example, if you live on post, the officers have access to better quality, larger housing that's also in a nicer area than the enlisted personnel. And some, if not many, wives tend to identify with their husband's job and their rank. They really kind of adopt this into their identity. And then they also use this identification to structure their own life with a similar socio-spatial identification. For instance, officers' wives are expected to volunteer their time for family readiness groups. So these groups put on fundraisers and functions, and they help families through deployments, but they also do, barbecues and coffees, and there's something called the Officers' Wives Club, things like that. And the fact that there's the term military wife, I think it carries a lot of meaning, and it's a widely accepted term in society, so I think it suggests that there is this distinct identity. So the main point here is that if wives of men in other professions aren't entirely blending their identities with their partner's job, why do military spouses? And since wives of enlisted and officers tend to include their husband's rank into their identity, are there differences between them as well? So the purpose of the present study was to explore the military spouse's sense of place and home, because they do move every 2 to 3 years. That's true for the American military and the Canadian forces as well. So our project will try to address the following questions. Does having attachments to other places relate to military spouses' sense of belonging, and how do they define home? So we had 60 heterosexual American military wives fill out an online survey. We recruited them through a snowball method, And 36% of them indicated that they do feel like they have another place that they call home, but then 46% of them also considered their current residence as home. So you're already starting to see that home is kind of a different meaning for them. So those who answered yes to is there another place that you call home, the first theme that emerged was that of childhood. So most people referred to home as their hometown. Some still consider their parents' house their home, even though they're 30 years old. So here's one quote from one participant. She said, "I don't consider my current duty location home because I know one day we'll move again, so I look at this as a temporary home." The next theme that emerged was relationships. So for example, they often just defined home as where their family was. So the first woman said, "Home's where the army sends you. My home's where I make it for myself, where my husband and my kids are." And the second person said, "Home's where our family is. We've come to think of home not as the building that houses our stuff, but where we just currently live as a family." And then the last theme for this question is that of attachment. So it was really interesting because a lot of people didn't have a place attachment. They would say things like, home is all over, home is the US. We don't have a home until we retire. But then when you break it down between wives of enlisted and officer personnel, the opposite pattern emerges. So you can see wives of enlisted personnel really don't have a place attachment, whereas the primary responses from officers' wives are that of relationships. So perhaps that they're still attaching to relationships in their childhood home, and this might be because intimacy is extremely significant in the geographies of expatriate belonging. Friendships and familiar relationships are included. So it might be possible that they're realizing which attachments are place-based and which ones they can move with them. So for the next question, when and how does a place become home? The first thing that emerged was physical belonging. So they really defined home in terms of their stuff. So it becomes a home when your stuff arrives, when they can put their pictures up, when they can get new curtains. It wasn't their home before, but now they can make it ours, and it's ours for now, because it's temporary, right? And the next theme that emerged again was relationships. So in this sense, they're defining home in terms of their family. It becomes a home when they're all together. It doesn't matter where it is. It could be a basement rental, it could be a 2-story house, but it's home when we're together. And then the next woman says, "It's a place where my family's complete. My husband's not away. I have my husband and my children. It could be anywhere, even if we're living in a tent on the beach or in a jungle. It doesn't matter where they live as long as they're together." And then the last theme that emerged was familiarity. So as soon as a home, you've been there for a while, you know where to put the keys, you get invited to bunco, and you know how to get around and you have a flow again, that's another theme that emerged when they can have their routine. And this is it's really long, I'm sorry. It's one of my favorite quotes. So one woman said, home's where the army sends you, and then she describes the story of her 2-year-old son saying that he wants to go home, and then his 5-year-old brother, in a very soothing tone, said to him, "We don't have a home." And so the mom was really touched by this because she was thinking that he was sending this message that although we don't have a house, we're all in this together and everything's going to be okay. As long as we have our family and our routine and our traditions, it doesn't matter. You can always count on Muffin Monday during the school year, and the routine and tradition is just really what makes our house. And again, differences emerge depending on whether or not they were a wife of an enlisted or an officer personnel, so it's like the opposite pattern, just like it was before. So officers' wives tend to define home more with physical belongings, whereas wives of enlisted personnel were really defining home in terms of relationships. So in sum, there was a lack of emotional attachment to place. They tended to really detach from whatever area they were in. They defined home in terms of physical belongings and relationships, and the differences emerged depending on their partner's rank. So these two groups of women are clearly attaching in different ways, but it's hard to disentangle the effects of age and rank and frequency of moves because officers' wives are also a little bit older. They were in their younger 30s, whereas the enlisted wives were lower to mid-20s. So the officers' wives also moved more often. Their husband had a higher rank, so there's lots of other things that are going on. But I plan on trying to disentangle this a little bit. So they didn't attach to place, so I'm curious to see if this becomes a source of strain and just pressure on the family because their family is really all they attach to. So what happens if something happens to their partner, then, you know, what are they attached to? What if they lose their social support since they rely on relationships so much? And how does this affect their perception of home if they do lose a piece of this social support? And they really value family. I think they value family in a very unique way than other families maybe do. And they also discussed routine as being reproduced to likely preserve identity and belonging. So they could have been relying on a space-based routine versus time-based, because they can represent this in any new place, whereas a time-based routine maybe wouldn't transfer as much. And they were defining home through physical belongings. So we think that this might allow them to symbolize their emotional experiences. So material practices of homemaking reveal a sense of belonging through preferences of emotional geographies, of intimacy, so photos, for example, or, you know, the curtains they made or something like that. So possessions in this sense take on an intense significance to them. These objects are often used in an attempt to find a material connection with social intimacy that they haven't been able to have. And not only with these questions, but other questions that I asked them, there was overwhelmingly positive responses. So they could have been maybe a little bit defensive in limiting losses. They might have, I don't know for sure, but they might have believed that a negative response might have meant that they had a negative view on their husband or their lifestyle, but they seemed really genuinely happy with their lives, and they also, it sounded like they really loved moving so often. I don't know if it started out that way, but it definitely became that way. That's it.